Sanguinius occupies a unique position within imperial and transhuman history. Among the Primarchs, he is remembered as the most noble, the most virtuous, and possibly the most universally admired. His death aboard the Vengeful Spirit during the final confrontation of the Horus heresy has become one of the defining myths of the Imperium. It is well known that he confronted Horus before the Emperor's arrival, and that he paid for that defiance with his life. But the question remains whether Sanguinius could have beaten Horus under those circumstances. That question requires more than a simple assessment of martial prowess. It demands a deeper examination of context, metaphysics, psychological states, and the nature of the warp influence shaping Horus at the time. To judge whether Sanguinius could have emerged victorious, one must first understand not only who he was, but what the universe had become in that moment. Sanguinius had always been among the most potent of the Primarchs. His physical power and capability in battle were unquestionable, but his true strength lay in what others saw in him. He inspired belief, loyalty, and trust to a degree unmatched by any of his brothers. Even when compared to Guilliman's administrative brilliance or the Lion's strategic ruthlessness, Sanguinius possessed the singular ability to unite through presence rather than compulsion. The Emperor recognized this early, deploying Sanguinius and the 9th Legion repeatedly as peacemakers, examples, and stabilizing forces. His psychic gifts, particularly foresight, were not merely symbolic. They informed his decision-making, though they also became a burden. Long before the Siege of Terra, Sanguinius foresaw his own death. He knew that the path ahead lay to sacrifice, and that knowledge shaped his actions. To examine whether he could have defeated Horus, one must therefore assess the condition of both combatants at the final confrontation. The Horus that Sanguinius faced was not the same Primarch who stood proudly beside the Emperor at Ulanor. After the events of Davin and the gradual corruption that followed, Horus became the chosen instrument of the Chaos Gods. By the time he stood aboard the Vengeful Spirit at the Siege of Terra, he was elevated in all respects. Physically, his enhancements surpassed even the baseline transhuman perfection of the Primarch form. Psychically, he was empowered through direct warp apotheosis. Spiritually, he was the conduit of 4 Chaos Gods acting in unison, entities that rarely aligned but had for this singular moment found purpose. It is difficult to quantify what this meant in practical terms, but even the Emperor recognized that Horus had become an existential threat to humanity. Without intervention, the galaxy itself might have been reshaped in the traitor's image. In contrast, Sanguinius entered the duel depleted. He had fought relentlessly for the entire Siege of Terra. He had suffered the emotional load of seeing his sons fall to the Red Thirst and the Black Rage. He had commanded a legion under catastrophic circumstances, holding the ultimate gate against impossible numbers. Even a Primarch had limits, and Sanguinius reached that moment in a condition of exhaustion, grievous injury, and psychological strain. Horus meanwhile stood at the height of his empowerment, a demigod amplified by the warp. Assessing the realistic potential for Sanguinius to win means recognizing the degree of asymmetry inherent in the confrontation itself. Combat capability among Primarchs can be broadly contextualized through narrative and contextual evidence. Sanguinius is consistently portrayed as among the most talented, rivaled only by a handful of his brothers. Even Horus himself said that if it came to a duel of pure combat skill, Sanguinius would be among the few capable of challenging him. But potential does not equate to outcome. Throughout the heresy, the changing nature of Horus's power is repeatedly emphasized. He was no longer simply a Primarch but a champion of entities that could rewrite the substance of reality through psychic medium. His presence on Davin demonstrated this, as did the effect of his aura on Space Marines and mortals alike. When he faced Sanguinius at the end, he embodied a level of warp saturation unmatched by any loyalist Primarch. However, raw power alone cannot answer this question. One must first analyze the psychological dimension also. Horus had abandoned restraint by this stage. The Horus that once loved his brothers, respected the Emperor, and valued his father's project were gone. In his place stood a being that had surrendered entirely to annihilation. Sanguinius, by contrast, still carried conviction. He believed that his death might be necessary for the Emperor to succeed, That conviction mattered, but it also meant that he never truly entered the duel as a combatant fighting for personal victory. He fought to delay Horus, to weaken him, to do anything possible to improve the Emperor's chances. This mindset was crucial material. A warrior fighting to win behaves differently than one fighting to buy time. There are accounts describing Sanguinius as having moments of defiance so powerful that even Horus was taken aback. In some versions of the narrative, Sanguinius manages to wound Horus in the duel, striking a blow that the traitor does not anticipate. This detail is significant. It implies that even in his weakened, exhausted state, and even against an ascended demigod of chaos, Sanguinius remained dangerous. This counters any interpretation that he was hopelessly outclassed. Sanguinius was capable of hurting Horus. He may even have forced the traitor to re-evaluate his invincibility. Such a blow may have aided the Emperor later in terms of psychological impact. Horus's confidence mattered, and any disruption could shift that balance. Yet wounding Horus is not equivalent to defeating him. To kill Horus, Sanguinius would have had to overcome not only a physically superior opponent, but the active agenda of 4 warp powers working in concert. The Chaos Gods had invested too much in Horus's success to allow him to fall in single combat to another Primarch, no matter how potent. The Champion of Chaos served as a linchpin of their campaign. By this point, Horus was functionally the avatar of their will. Even if Sanguinius had gained the upper hand, the metaphysical dimension of the duel suggests intervention would have occurred. One must recall that even the Emperor, one of the most powerful psychic entities in the entire galaxy, hesitated to strike Horus down fully when he saw the fleeting remnants of his son's uncorrupted self. That moment required emotional resolution. Sanguinius lacked that opportunity entirely. Even so, hypotheticals remain valuable. If we imagine in an alternative scenario in which Sanguinius faced Horus earlier in the heresy, before the War Master's full ascension, the duel becomes more balanced. Sanguinius was one of the few Primarchs who might have defeated Horus under conventional circumstances. His combat capability, psychic gift, and martial nobility made him quite formidable. Horus himself admitted that a confrontation with Sanguinius could go either way before his corruption. In such a scenario, without the full backing of the warp, the duel becomes a contest of Primarchs rather than metaphysical proxies. That is a battle Sanguinius might realistically have won. But that is not the duel that occurred. Shifting to a more conversational and opinionated tone for a moment, I think the most practical way to look at it is this. Sanguinius didn't go into that fight with a realistic chance of winning, and deep down he knew that. The Horus he faced wasn't his brother anymore. He was basically a walking warp weapon with 4 Chaos Gods propping him up. Sanguinius wasn't just tired. He had fought his way across Terra, lost his sons to mutation and madness, and taken injuries that would have killed lesser beings. People sometimes underestimate how significant that cumulative exhaustion was. If he had met Horus fresh or earlier in the heresy, maybe there could have been a real chance. In fact, I'd probably say he would have won. But in the state that he was in, it just wasn't a reasonable expectation. What matters, at least in a way that I interpret it, is that Sanguinius still fought on anyway. He didn't believe he was going to win. He believed his death might matter. And in the logic of the setting, he was right, because his resistance created the opening that allowed the Emperor to finally do what needed doing. So the tragedy is that Sanguinius was powerful enough to challenge Horus, but by the time it mattered, the universe had already shifted too far against him. Sanguinius' death fulfills several narrative functions within the broader mythos of the Imperium. It represents the loss of innocence within the Imperium's founding generation. Sanguinius was the ideal, the reflection of what humanity might have become. He embodied hope, nobility, and the implicit promise that the future could be better. Horus represented the collapse of that promise. Their duel therefore becomes allegorical. It is not simply 2 demigods fighting aboard a battle cruiser. It is the symbolic death of an optimistic galaxy, replaced by one defined by stagnation and endless war. The Emperor's final confrontation with Horus could not have had the same emotional weight without Sanguinius' prior sacrifice. The War Master had to kill not just a brother, but the best of them, to fully commit to damnation. The question of whether Sanguinius could have beaten Horus therefore resolves into a layered conclusion. In a purely physical and skill-based context, yes, Sanguinius may have had the capability to defeat Horus under neutral conditions earlier in the heresy. Their power levels, tactical intellect, and warrior aptitude were close enough that such a victory would not strain plausibility. But at the Siege of Terror, when Horus fully ascended and Sanguinius exhausted, wounded, and carrying emotional devastation, the duel was effectively unwinnable. The outcome was predetermined not by plot convenience, but by metaphysical reality. Horus had become the sum of four gods' invested might. Sanguinius had become the last defiant symbol of a falling golden age. In that light, Sanguinius' death was never a tactical defeat. It was a deliberate act of resistance. It wounded Horus psychologically, disrupted his sense of inevitability, and brought the Emperor crucial fractions of time. Most importantly, it cemented Sanguinius as a martyr, not merely as a Primarch who fell, but as the embodiment of the cost of the heresy. His death resonates because he fought long after victory was impossible. Within the logic of the Imperium, that alone made him victorious in the only terms that matter. This archive has now been fully decoded. Continue your journey with the video displayed on screen. The vast wealth of the archives continues to reveal new knowledge of the dark history of the 40k verse. In the grim dark of the far future, there is only war.